Okay, good. Sorry about that. We didn't miss that much. So, but yes, the online folks, please feel free to come off of mute to ask any questions. Typically, when there's different presenters, I'm actually monitoring the chat to see what there is. It's just me today. So,
question
yeah.
from the online folks. Can you share
sure.
The actual demo screen? I see the cameras, which are very cool, but I can't see the demo screen.
Good catch.
Yep, that did it. Thank you.
All right, cool, perfect. Okay, so well, I'll just step back a little bit then. So today, right, we're going to do EDW load pattern into, in this case, we're just going to load it into a basic SQL Server in Azure SQL DB, a very tiny one. And so we're using one of the Microsoft sample databases to do it. What I've already done for this is extracted a handful of tables. I've already got the extracts created and uploaded into blob storage, which is where our ADF kind of picks up from. For actually a quick polling, how many of you guys are very new to Azure Data Factory? So, okay. Okay, so majority of the room. So I won't skip over some of the stuff that I thought I was going to skip over. So Azure Data Factory, that is your default de facto tool in Azure for ETL purposes. It is quite powerful, as you will see, but it is also a cloud native tool. So one of the things that I guess I'm not demonstrating here today is in this case, this would be mimicking like a SQL Server that is on premise. So Azure Data Factory, again, it has a small plugin that's built into it called an integration runtime. So it's a small program that you install anywhere on premise that has line of sight to the internet and to the source systems that you are planning to work with, or also destination, right? It just has to have that pathway to whatever you're connecting with. It's a pretty lightweight application, so typically you just pick some random virtual machine on your network, get that installed out there. The installation process is very, very simple. You just go through you pretty much hit next, next, next. The one piece from the Azure Data Factory side, which we can take a look at, is on the Azure Data Factory side. You would go into the manage area, go into integration runtime, and then this is where you would actually create the integration runtime, which is essentially setting up that linkage between this cloud resource and the piece of little applet that's going to run on a box on-prem. So let me just do a self-hosted. I'll just create it. So it took only a few seconds, but this is what I wanted to show you, is that it then generates a special authentication key. This thing actually has all of the details. It has all of the details to make that connection work. So in this case, it's got a GUID, and then it's got details of what is the name of the Azure Data Factory, and then the endpoint URL, and then the actual key. So Microsoft makes it super easy because all I have to do is just take this long string and paste it into, I might still have it on this computer. I won't be able to show you that screen because it's already set up. But when you install it and then you go to configure it, there would just be a big box in here where you just paste it. And then what that thing does is it establishes the connection between whatever this device is and the cloud resource. And it allows that network connectivity from on-premise resources to the cloud. There's no service account or any of that kind of stuff, so it makes it even more easier. When you're connecting to a SQL server on-prem, in your connection string, just as you would do in SSIS, that's where your authentication information is then being passed at that time, whether it's LDAP, right? So then you would do like the domain/username and then whatever the password is. But it uses the native SQL Server, connection stuff to make that happen. Any questions about that? Okay. So this one you can say again. Go ahead.
They do that so you can rotate them easier. So
Yeah.
say you want to rotate keys, you can take the second one and input it in, and then rotate the first key, and then it over again.
The folks online, were you able to hear that, or do we need to talk louder?
Could not hear it.
Okay. Well, feedback to Alex. This thing's a microphone. So the question was, Aaron had very, very quickly, I'm surprised how quickly you noticed that, because I think I was only on the screen for like 5 seconds. But he had noticed how there are 2 keys in here. And so what Jason pointed out, and this is a theme in all things the cloud. This is a lot of the best practices that typically never get followed with on-premise stuff, that they've kind of baked it into almost everything, especially on the Azure side. It's baked into almost everything. Anywhere where there is a connection string, there will always be a primary and secondary. So it's there to provide you the ability to do rotation. And then you can build automation on top of it to actually do this automatically. But if I hover over actually I can click it because this is not hooked up to anything. I'm just going to hover over it, and that will regenerate the key. And so now if I copy it, you'll see that the key, the code piece of it changed compared to what I had earlier. So that's what that stuff is there for. Cool. You can disregard this one. So this one is just unavailable because it's obviously not hooked up to anything, right? I've essentially initiated the cloud piece of it. It's not. It's complaining that it's actually not paired with anything. It's not getting a signal from anything on-prem because I didn't paste that link, that gibberish anywhere. So that's what an integration runtime is. It allows that connectivity. But going back to okay, so going back to the SQL Server, and for this demo purposes, we're just going to skip past the part of actually acquiring the data from wherever. But the point of this is that obviously Azure Data Factory can also do that. It can connect to anything. The connectors it actually has is quite massive beyond your generic SQL. Obviously, all of the Microsoft system ecosystem is First Citizen, but also a lot of the other ones like Oracle and even SaaS applications like Salesforce is kind of built in there. Most of the common ones are in there. So it can pull in the data. So for this demonstration purposes, this little application, it's called the Azure Storage Explorer. It's a nice little utility that gives you a nicer experience to traverse the blob storage account that's out there in the cloud versus doing it through the web interface. But I wanted to show you the files that are actually in here. So there is this storage account. which has a couple, can you see that pretty well? Which has a couple blob containers created. So blob containers are like the top level folder, and think of a storage account almost like a NAS, but in the cloud. So this is your top level container, and then inside that you've got your data. So in this case, for today's presentation, oh. No arrow. Today, I'm putting everything inside here, inside the ADF demo container.
What's that tool?
Azure Storage Explorer. So the difference between this, sorry, this Bastion session always throws me off. So you can also still navigate to that blob storage from Azure Portal. And typically it has a link in here, otherwise you can Google. It's one of the many free tools that are out there. But if I go to containers, and so the user experience is almost the same, except the tool does a few things better. It is a better user experience. And then especially for moving stuff around, usually this tool makes it significantly easier. So if I wanted to like copy and paste these files to a different folder, doing it through the tool is a lot better, because behind the scenes it's doing Azure CLI commands. It's just more efficient at it. Okay, anyway. So what we'll do is create a new data factory. So walking through this process briefly, I'm creating new Azure Data Factory. Where is past summon? I'll kind of gloss over some of the Azure basic stuff because I want to focus more on just the ADF tool. But the resource group, it's just a logical container where you can put all your stuff in. In this case, I had a resource group created called Past Summit 2021 for a presentation I did a while back. So it's just an easier way to organize all of your content, because then, especially for stuff like this, once I'm done with it, I can delete the entire resource group and know with an absolute certainty that, you know, everything is gone as long as I'm putting everything in there. Plus a whole bunch of other benefits. Call this live. So we'll give the Azure Data Factory a name, and then you have to pick the region that this is deployed in. It is best practice to create this in the same region as where the rest of your stuff is, more importantly, where your data is. So, you know, region is like literally the data center. So North Central, for example, is Chicago. East is like somewhere in Virginia. So if you have a piece of code that's executing somewhere in Virginia and you're working off of 10 terabytes of data in Chicago, you're still, you know, you're going to come up against speed of flight issues, regardless of how good the connectivity is. So there will be some performance issues there, right? So always be cognizant of that. It is a field that is very easily overlooked, and it'll always, I think it always defaults to East US. So you'll always, if you're not careful, you will end up creating stuff accidentally. So pick that version. Oh, good. I haven't seen this before. Always pick V2. V1 was, as it is the version 1 of Azure Data Factory, you don't even want to bother going in there. This piece is one of my favorite pieces in here, and I'm going to skip over it. But it kind of it promotes good practice. So right away from the get-go, it's asking you to hook it up to your source control system. so that from the get-go, everything is in source control, right? Just good development practices, which I'm going to skip over. We'll skip over some of these other more advanced topics for today. And hit create. So what this is actually creating is, and this is a fairly odd concept to kind of get your head wrapped around. It took me a while when I was first getting started with this. So Azure Data Factory, it's essentially created a workspace for you to do all of your ETL activities. And so think of this pretty much as your ETL server, where you're going to then develop things inside, create all those SSIS packages or whatever inside it. It gives you ways to organize your content by using folders and things like that. But typically, you would want to have only a handful of data factories provisioned in your environment. You may split it up by maybe different departments. For example, we've got folks from our IT area. They might have their own set of Azure Data Factories that's doing their own stuff. And then from my side, I might have my own ADF that I have access to, and then is hooked up to things that I have going on, right? Including my own integration runtime somewhere in the on-premise network. Okay, so yeah, so yes, so that's another thing that comes with the resource group and how you organize your stuff in Azure. It has that hierarchy, right? You could put it at the highest level, or you could go down, in this case, at the, so let me just quickly, let me go into this resource group. So this resource group, for example, has a whole bunch of stuff that's supporting all these demos. If you had noticed, like I hopped onto a VM, for example, the virtual machine is in here, and a few other Azure Data Factories are in here. My blob storage account is in here. So at the resource group level, I can grant access. I can set up permissions to like a ADF contributor, which basically gives you access to do ADF stuff. But that's at the resource group level, right? So then everything inherits from it. So any ADF in here you would have access to. Or you can then go down more granular and go right down to, let's say, Aaron, I'll give you access just to this one and not the live one, right? We'll just pretend that this is the dev one. And so in here, under access management, I can then grant you access. And you can kind of see some of that stuff. So there are some things coming from a higher level. So that's how that works. So in here is just the resource. So then you can get to it by either navigating your way into here or just opening a browser and going to adf.azure.com. That will get you logged in. And it is, as you can see from the URL, right, it is a global address. So this is where it uses the rest of the Azure infrastructure to make this happen. But basically, you're logging in, and depending on who's logged in, it knows which directory you belong to and what stuff you have access to. So in here, it's enumerating everything, right? So I may have made Leonard at the organization level an ADF contributor. So all of a sudden, he might see like 50 of these, but I might have only set you up with this one individual. And so here you would see just the one. Okay, so 640. I might actually switch strategies. I was talking too much, so I'll just flip over to the one that I already have baked in. the classic cooking demo, right? I'm gonna do a cutscene. So we'll just focus on the patterns then. Just kind of walking through some of this stuff very quickly. So in Azure Data Factory, under the Manage area, there's a concept called like linked services. So this is basically it is almost similar to setting up like a connection manager in SSIS to like the SQL server you might want to be working with, or the network location, or the data warehouse. However, in here, one of the many advantages is that everything is parameterizable. So this is almost like and the linked service is really just, these are the kinds of things you want to work with. So I want a SQL connector, and I want a blob storage connector, and then during runtime, I can pass in stuff into here. So what I've done is created a link service to my blob storage, which is where all my flat files are residing, and then a link service into Azure SQL Database. Then moving on to the pencil area, which is where you're authoring all of these contents, is I've created a couple pipelines, and this is what I wanted to focus most of this presentation on. Is the practice I use here is breaking down your overall pipeline into smaller modular pieces so that they can be reused, re-executed at any time. So in this case, what's going to happen is we want to connect to the folder where all of our flat files are, get the listing of the folder, and then iterate through those files to load it into the SQL Server. Again, many things you probably couldn't do on the SSIS side of the world. You could do the folder scan, and you could do the for each loop. But when it comes to the actual data flow task, you would be creating, in this case, 4 or 5 different data flow things, right? You would take the sales, the invoices.txt file and put it into the dbo.invoices table, and then create another data flow or another package to do the customers text file into the customers table, and so on, right? For a handful of tables, not a big deal, but when you're doing a big EDW load, right, hundreds and hundreds of tables, that becomes not fun to deal with. Obviously, there's third-party tools that can help you with it, but this is all just default out of the box. So what I'll do is clone this one. So typically, what I like to then do is create a pipeline that's like my main triggering pipeline, which is then calling a bunch of stuff. So in this case, what this one was going to do is there's an activity in here called get metadata, which is from here. And this is a very powerful thing that you can use it for many things. In this case, what I'm doing is using it to get the child items from a directory that I provided. As you can see, there's a couple other things we can do with it. So this thing outputs, this thing will basically scan a folder and then outputs an array of all of the files that are in there. And then that array can then be passed on to the next stuff. So in this case, it would go into a for each loop, which its input is basically an array of items. And so here you're basically telling it to take the output from here and iterate through that. So what I want to show is, I'm going to delete this activity. Talk about parameterization a bit. So here at the pipeline level, I created a couple parameters by going into here. And this is where some of these best practices kind of comes in, is I've made this to be fairly generic because then at runtime, I can tell it actually go to this one container and this one folder to pull the data from. And then tomorrow I can tell it to go to a different container or in a different pathway and a bunch of other stuff, right? I can reconfigure this to process dataset 1, dataset 2, dataset 3, as long as the rest of the pattern is the same, which is flat file to SQL. So here the parameters have been configured, and then for the get metadata, you're giving it a data set to work off of. So in this case, I'm telling to use the blob storage linked service. And then when it comes to the actual path, this is where then you're able to, you can delete these. You could just hit the browse button and manually go there and hard code everything, right? So I'm going to go into ADF demo, into this folder, hit OK. That's where my files are, and you'll see that everything got hard coded in here. Or to make it really flexible, what I can do is then now we're at the data source level. So at the data source level, again, I'll create a couple parameters in here. I gave it the same names, container name and folder path. So once those parameters are created, so where the container would be, I can erase it out, and the GUI will kind of, whenever you're in the field, if you notice, as soon as I click onto it, it gives me this thing. And so this is kind of like the expression window that used to be there. Sorry. Expression window that used to be there in SSIS. So it takes me here, and then I can put in an expression for anything I want to put in here, right? There's a whole bunch of like typical string expressions that you would expect to find in any tool like this, like a replace, lower, upper, right? Stuff like that, like a substring operation. So if you want to manipulate some of that stuff. But in this case, I'm just going to pass in the container name parameter, and then you can kind of see what the syntax looks like. The newest enhancement in this is it actually now is smart enough to do IntelliSense, which is a life changer for me. I cannot, and the main reason I use this is because I don't trust my typing. But yeah, the IntelliSense, this I think only came in the last couple, maybe 3 months or something. So that was very, very good news. But the one thing that I'm still complaining about, that SSIS had a button in here somewhere that allowed you to hit like evaluate, so you could see what it's coming out to, especially when you're doing a lot of conversion stuff. Like I used to run into this when trying to get like that date time stamp thing, right? That one's a monster to do. There's nothing like that in here, which is kind of yeah, kind of hurts. The only thing, there is a syntax checker thing, so that is about as good as you're gonna get. So I'll put in the container and then the file path, same thing. You can go in here and just go to the folder path. And so I'm giving it these arguments. And so now when I go back to my pipeline and I tell it that I'm going to use this data set that I just created, those same parameters now bubbles its way up. And then I'm doing the same mapping. So now I'm saying the data set has a parameter called container name and a folder name, and I'm passing it in the parameters from the pipeline, right? And so this is how you're like connecting the dots between all of that. And you're able to then make this pretty dynamic. And the nice thing is like almost anything you see in here can be parameterized typically. Yeah. So any configuration item for the most part, can be parameterized, including when we get to the flat file, which I actually haven't created yet. We should be able to get to it. Okay, so the reason I did this is because I wanted to execute it. So when it comes time for execution, because again, everything is parameterized, I didn't set any default values, so I need to tell it ADF demo, and it's in raw /2022-0421. I'm gonna hit OK. So here, while this runs, we can talk about this real quick for a little bit. This is some of the differences, again, cloud versus SSIS. In here, you're not running on a dedicated box, right? And that's what makes it attractive, because you're paying for the few seconds this thing is going to run. So in this case, it ran for 3 seconds. That's what you ended up paying for. But the downside is there is a queuing process, right? So this, at the end of the day, you wrote some piece of code. That piece of code is being submitted into an array of computers somewhere in the Microsoft data center, right? So it's waiting for its turn to be executed. And sometimes, especially if you do some other more complex configurations like private VNets and stuff, sometimes the queuing time can be like 2 minutes, 3 minutes, which is, it happens, but you're saving a boatload of money. So the reason I wanted to run this is to, now that it's ran, I want to get your this stuff. Once you hover over it, there are a couple things that show up. You'll see basically input and output, right? So the input, when I click on it, it'll show this is all the stuff that was sent into this activity, into the get metadata activity. And then the output is everything that came out of it. So let's hover over it. I'll hit input. And you can kind of see all the arguments that I passed into it, right? So where's my mouse? Say again? Yeah, it is JSON. That's how the configuration is stored inside it. But this is, if we walk through it, right? This is, for example, that was that drop-down menu where we said I want the child items, and here's the parameters that we configured, and anything else would be in here. And then the output, which is what is really important, is this. So the output becomes really important when you're doing ADF development. This is my lazy way of doing it. You could go and read the Microsoft documentation to find out what does the JSON of an output of these things look like, and it'll tell you, for example, because we selected child items from that other drop-down menu, that it would show up like this. It would be child items and then an array inside it, and then it would have the attribute of name and type, right? That's a lot of reading. I'm lazy, so I would rather just execute it and then find out what does this JSON actually look like, right? And typically what I do is I copy this, put it into Notepad, because then in somewhere else, if you're following the trend here, right, I'm going to pass this as parameters into my next step somewhere. So basically I want a path. I have my container, I have my folder, I just need a file name now. So I'm going to put these things together in the next place. And to get at it, right, this is JSON notation. So it's going to end up being child items.name is where we're trying to get to. But in this case, this is an array. So child items, and then it's an array of stuff. And that's where the for each loop comes in. The for each loop is going to iterate over the output.child items. Following? Cool. So now if I go over, it's under iteration for each. I'm going to give this an easy name. So get file listing. And connect this to that. And so here in the for each loop, as soon as I click on it, come down here, go to settings. There's only a few settings in this one, so it needs an array to do a looping over. So to feed it an array, same thing, I can go to dynamic content. And now you'll notice that there's something new that wasn't there before, because there's now this new activity. It has an output, so it exposes that. You could obviously sit here and type it yourself. And thanks to IntelliSense, there it is. Get file listing. Remember, that's what I called it. Output. Well, it did too much for me. So you could do it that way, right? Or really just come down here, find the activity that you're after. Again, this get file listing is coming from the name that I put in here. So if I do this, so it gives you the starting point because it knows part of the ADF thing, right? It knows that the JSON message is going to start at that output element level. So now I want to go inside it, and child items is what I want. So now if I hit OK, what's happening is it's passing that array into here, and then I can do stuff with it. One thing I want to call out is inside the for each loop button here is super important. This is one of my favorite features of ADF. By default, it runs in parallel. So if I was ingesting 30 files, it would still do a for each loop, but it would do those 30 things in parallel. You may still have some use cases where you actually want it to be done sequential. So by checking this box, it'll do it sequentially. Yeah.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite features of this too.
You may have to speak loudly.
And one of the big issues I've actually run into with this is with the batch count. The batch count becomes important because if you, let's say, iterate over 100 files, you only have a certain number of cores you can use at one time. And so if you hit that limit, it'll just bomb out.
Yep.
So a large number of loops in your for each loop can be throttled with that batch count, which has helped a lot.
Yeah, I think, isn't it the default is a 50? Is the max is like the default, it'll do 50 or whatever. But yeah, so the batch, that's what the sequential is. So the batch count, this is putting the upper limit. So if I say 3, it'll only execute 3 things in parallel. So even beyond cloud capacity though, so like right now we're working on a project, unfortunately not in Azure Data Factory though, but on a project that's taking a data warehouse, an on-prem data warehouse, and bringing it into the cloud. So it's the source system is a SQL Server on-prem. So when it comes to that, I have to be careful. I don't want to let it just go nuts, right? I don't want it to import 50 fact tables simultaneously off of the SQL Server. Somebody would murder me, right? Like that's not so. So that's where some of these things kind of, these knobs you can kind of play around with. So for something like that, right? Maybe set it to 3. But maybe if then you're back to general operations and you're doing incremental loads, maybe you can get away with 10, 15 extracts at the same time from the source system. Or also same thing on the destination thing too, right? If you're loading an RDMS system and it's in the middle of the business day, maybe you want to throttle that. So that's what these settings are. And then inside activity, this is where, if you notice the canvas over here, we are right now in the pipeline canvas. And then as soon as I go into it, now I'm inside this for each loop. So anything I put in here, right, would happen inside that for each loop, for example. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to go back to the one I had running. Okay, so we're looking at the main. So it did the file listing, and then there's a for each loop. And then what's happening in here, same thing, we have the same kind of parameters. It's got the container name, it's got the ingest folder, and then the for each loop is iterating over the output from the get metadata. Inside the for each loop, this is where the modularity kind of comes in. So now I'm going to have it actually call another pipeline, which is then set up to do just another small piece of code. And the benefit of this then is this pipeline can handle just one specific task. And then I can call this over and over again. Or if something breaks, let's say out of your 50 files, 2 of them failed or something, right? So then I can come back and just run this piece and then manually give it all of the values that I would want to give it. For example, the container name, the folder, and then the individual file I want it to process. So this is where that code modularity comes in. So now following this EDW design pattern, what I have here is yet another new activity. It's called the lookup activity. So this allows you to essentially execute something against the SQL server or against something to get something back. In this case, I'm having it. What I have is a control. Oh no. Why did it? Actually, I don't think I need. I already have the data in there, so I don't need the VM anymore. I don't know why it shut down on me. I can't blame you guys. This is not your guys' area.
You can blame me anyway. That's what most people do.
I saw you lose Wi-Fi connection.
That's them.
It's all in our
Sorry.
name.
It's always IT.
How stable is Azure Data Factory? Are there lots of resets, reboots, things of that nature?
Oh, it's very, very stable. Like I mean, just like anything else, you will have issues from time to time. You know, since I talked about queuing, for example, I had a random incident in the East region a few months ago, and oddly enough, it was 2 days before a go live of this data warehouse load running. But my job ended up being stuck in a queued state for like 15 hours. So my trigger job ran. It just nothing had happened yet. So I went and looked. It was sitting in a queued state. I tried canceling it. Even the canceling was in a queued state. Tried re-executing another one, and that second submission was also in a queued state. It ended up being an outage on the Microsoft side, but it's very rare. So I would say from a stability standpoint, this is going to be 100 times better than an on-prem SSIS or anything on-prem. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's good to know. I've been using Talend, and Talend sometimes gets flaky. You just have to shut it down, and when it starts going stupid, you have to shut it down and restart it. And some of those controls, like you drop in, the options just don't work. It says do parallel. Well, it won't do parallel. It only does one thread. So things of that nature.
Sure. So, I mean, Talend is it's hosted wherever it's executing. It's hosted on some machine somewhere, right? Like, you would have to have it installed on like a VM in Azure or a EC2 instance in AWS.
We have remote execution engines. We actually have, like, those are hosted internally in our
Okay.
environments. And you can also have external ones hosted by Talend. Yeah.
Can I not? So, okay. Well, I was trying to show a what that table looks like, but basically I have a so before I go on that, the one thing I wanted to point out, to your question, so the one extra nice feature about ADF is that this is a true 100% serverless process. So there isn't a computer for you to reboot or anything like that, right? It is fully managed product on the Microsoft Azure environment. And that I think is a plus, because we were looking at Talend and Matillion and stuff, and you still have to worry about deploying those remote execution things on some box somewhere. So you still have something you have to manage, and so that's the one upside on this. Well, one of the many, I should say. So if I go to pipeline runs, debug. I just want to show you what that output looks like. So I was having issues getting back into the VM.
So can you explain what the VM was for? Is that just an example of like an on-prem SQL server or something like that?
Yeah, it was an example for that. And then also I had connectivity into the Azure SQL database, which but yeah, it's also like part of the infrastructure was already there. So like I already had my database there and stuff. So I created my I created my extract files from there to put into the cloud. But let's just quickly want to get in here. All things I should not be doing in front of a security guy.
One's ever done a secure demo, so it's fine.
All right. So. Okay, we are back in business. So this is what the lookup activity is doing. And so this is part of the ETL load pattern. This isn't unique to ADF though. This practice is usually applied in many different tools. But what that lookup activity is going to do is pass in the file name, which would, and then it uses that file name to get back the rest of the stuff. So in this case, invoices file comes in, and it knows that it's going to go into the DBO dot, or it's going to go into the stage dot invoices table, and then another process later on is going to then merge that into the destination schema. So in this case, it's the DBO schema. And I just realized The name is missing. Dot text. Okay, that looks better. That would not have resulted anything. Okay, so the thing that's going to get passed in here is like invoices.txt, for example. So if we quickly go to back to Azure Data Factory, go into here, go into this other pipeline. So the only thing it has in here right now is called the get config values. So on the database, and this is kind of overkill for this kind of a simplistic demo, but typically I have a store procedure for this because typically there are a lot of other nuances. A lot of times, for example, the file name comes in with a lot of extra stuff, like it might have a date time stamp or something, like there's usually a pattern to it. And so for whatever systems, I'm usually cleansing that stuff out in SQL instead of trying to build more elaborate stuff in ADF for that. So it's usually just been easier to just call a stored procedure. So in this case, what it would be doing is, again, I have it hooked up to one of the SQL data sets. However, this is hard-coded because this is not something that's going to change. But given that earlier statement, right? Like anything can be configured to be dynamic. So I can click edit, for example, and then put in, and then that gives me this box, which gives me the editor. But we don't want to do that. So as soon as you select a stored procedure, then it's got more stuff in here to make your life easier. I can hit input parameter, which then actually connects to the SQL server and gets the metadata. And in this case, this stored procedure has a parameter in the stored procedure called file name. And so here I'm passing it the file name that comes from the for each loop. Okay. Going back to that for each loop is here when you're calling that pipeline, it brings in all of the parameters that pipeline wants. And so this is the one piece I overlooked. So when it came to file name, there's a different thing in here. It's item.name. And that's because I'm inside the for each loop. So remember, there's an array that came in, and that array had a name value, name and type are the two attributes, and I wanted name. So item.name gets me the actual file name. So it passes this into this pipeline, which brings me to here. So in here, the parameter name is just file name, and so that's also why it's pipeline.parameters.file name and not item.name. So let me just quickly run. I'm just going to put this. Okay, I'm just going to run this so you guys can see what that output looks like, because again, that'll then help you for your next phase. So I'm running this in debug mode, and we'll see stuff come out. Also notice that this, in debug mode, it's limited to not, it doesn't do parallelism. But if I actually ran this in a normal execution mode, which I'll also show in a moment, it actually would have fired off these load to DWs like 5 times because there's 5 text files in there. But if I go into one of these load DWs, so I want to show you the output of what does this one's output look like. So the input is there's that stored procedure. It's running. The stored procedure, and here is that file name that got passed in from the previous loop. In this case, this is all this stored procedure needs is just the invoice.lines.txt to then find out the rest of the stuff. So then if I go to the output here so this is what the output looks like. So in this case, here are all of the fields, but as you can imagine, in places that I'm going to use this, right, it's then going to end up being first row dot whatever. So in this case, when it comes to doing a insert into the table, it would be first row dot stage schema name and first row dot stage table name. Okay, so I'm going to just copy this. And then we'll do this part together. So now, now that I have everything ready, I know the file name and I also know where I'm putting it. Now I can actually do the load piece of it, the more exciting piece of it. And so just like any typical data flow thing, I need to give it the input and output, right? The source and destination. In ADF, it uses the terminology sync all over the place instead of destination, so source and sync. So if I go to source, I don't have a generic data set yet, so I will create that. In this case, my files are located in blob storage. So I'll select blob. This is a delimited type of file. I'll give this data set a name. It's using the blob storage link service. Remember that that's the thing that has the connector. I'm not going to fill any of these in for now, and this is just the weird quirkiness of this interface. I'm going to hit OK. It'll come here. It's set up that connection to that data set. But now I'm going to hit open, and it gives me some more of the advanced settings. So the path I didn't give it anything about where to get it from. So I'll go through the same process. But if you notice, if I go to container and I go inside here, there's nothing for me to pick from, right? Because this is a brand new data set that I just created, and the data set doesn't have any parameters of its own yet. So inside the data set, I'll go to parameters and do the same container name. Folder path name. I want delimiter. I don't know if that's right. I want to show that for a second. Okay. So I created a few parameters. Now if I go here, do dynamic, you'll notice there's a lot more stuff. So I'm going to map the container name to that, directory to folder path, file name to file name. Again, this sounds repetitive, but everything is kind of customizable here. So this is where this becomes a favorite tool of mine. I can create, you'll notice I gave it a fairly generic name, DS for dataset, extract text file, not worldwide importers flat file or something. Because I want to use this over and over again for any text file pattern, right? And then other common settings like what is the delimiter? Even that I can then parameterize. So I'll hit edit and put the delimiter parameter in there. So that really opens us up to, you know, a limitless, in this case, this is a pipe. So I'm going to skip that. It makes this, you know, super flexible, including the, you know, is it a CRLF type file? Everything, anything in here can be parameterized. So that is super awesome, super powerful. So now that I've created this, go back into here. My source is all set. So now those parameters bubbled its way back up to here. So now at the copy data activity, I would have to do the same thing, map it to things at the pipeline level. So these are all these are parameters that the other thing passes into it. So ingest folder. You can see I was not very consistent with my naming. Some places I called it ingest folder, other places it's just folder path. File name. Actually, no. Oh yeah, this is, we are in the pipeline, not the for each loop. So passed in all of that stuff. More things in here I'll skip over in the interest of time. Go to sync. So I want to put it into a generic, so SQL, and also you can kind of see the plethora of things you can connect to. But I want a SQL, Azure SQL database. This one would be if I'm connecting to like a on-premise SQL server. So I'm going to call it
Snowflake connector there.
Say again?
Is there a Snowflake connector there?
I believe there is SQL table. So I will come back to that. So I gave it a generic name, pointing it to my linked service. And then again, I'm going to skip over. There is technically, I can hit advanced and go to open this data set. I don't know if it was my computer. Every once in a while when I've done it, it crashes my Edge browser. So I'm skipping over it to take me to that page that link would have taken me to. So as you can kind of guess, I probably want to parameterize this, right? This is the common theme here. So I could, right, hard code the tables, but I'm going to hit edit and pass in this stuff. Can you guys see what I might be missing right now? There's nothing for me to pick. Right, and that's because this is a net new data set. I have not created my parameters yet. So I'm going to call it schema name, table name. Now, schema name, table name. Thanks for coming, man.
Sorry, on my bike and running out of daylight.
No, it's all good. Table name. So I've done that. So if you were hard coding stuff, you could play around with the schema stuff. I'm not doing anything in here. I'm keeping it pretty vanilla to just hit the thing I wanted to interact with, and then everything is done at runtime essentially. So gave it the schema name, table name, and then now back here, those things have come. So now it's going to be the get config values, the output of this thing. And then we're going to have to work our way through. In this case, it didn't know the output because this one is really more dynamic. But this is where this copy paste job helps out. So really, I want to get to first row. So I'm going to copy that because I cut type. What am I filling out? Schema name. So I want the staging schema name like so. Hit OK. And then I will do the same for the table name. So here, dot first row. Yep. takes care of that. One thing that's nice is the copy activity when you're pointing to a SQL database of that kind. It has a pre-copy script. This in the SSIS world used to be two things, right? You would typically in this pattern, you're going to do a truncate and then load into your staging table. So you would usually have a script task or whatever, execute the truncate and then do this. Here we can put in that stuff. So let's configure everything else, right? Behavior, I'm going to do an insert, bulk insert, right, that you guys are familiar with. Pre-copy script. So here I want to do truncate table. So you might be wondering, how am I going to pass in truncate table? Because this is all going to be dynamic. Are you ready for this? I should be a showman. So here we'll use some of the other fun stuff that's in here. So under functions, again, I can, start typing it like concat string list item. So, but I will show you the menu. So navigate my way down to string functions, and this is what I'm looking for is concat. And it gives you an example. So here, the syntax is, so for any text, it is single quotes. Just something you have to get used to. So truncate table space. And then in my driver table, to make my life easier, I actually have the fully qualified name as well that's loaded in there. Obviously, we're using concat, right? So you could do a schema dot, that whole parameter schema dot and then plus and all that stuff. I'm just going to do this. So get first row dot this thingy. So from here, I can. One thing you'll notice is now that the @ sign is only needed at the very, very, very beginning. That's what's telling this that, hey, I'm putting some formula, some expression in here. Now that you're inside that, the first @ sign, I don't need the @ signs anymore. So if you'll notice, I'll put in this one and the @ sign didn't get added. So output dot first row dot this. And that is it. So I'm going to hit publish. No value provided for delimiter. Oh, did I actually? Silly. Not even using it. I don't. Well, I should just delete. Validate. Good. Publish. This is writing this back to the service. And this time, instead of debug, I'm going to hit actual execute, so you can see things run in parallel. We're running long. So I'm going to hit trigger now. And I'm executing the main one. So what's going to happen is it'll do the iteration, it'll go into the for each loop, and then in the for each loop, it calls my second package, passes on all of those parameters from the for each loop, and then we'll execute the individual things. So if I go to, before I did a debug, as I mentioned, when you're in debug mode, it doesn't give you any level of parallelism. So you didn't get to see that happen in parallel. So I'm going to hit trigger now, and my default parameters are there. Hit OK. And then go over to see that thing run. So here, I'm going to keep hitting refresh. We should, yeah, it's fired off right away. So that's what I wanted to show you, is that parallelism. This is only like 50, 60 megs of data, so it's nothing too exciting. It'll finish off right away. But I'll go into just one of these random ones. So I'll go to output. That allows me to drill into that execution of that pipeline. Wait, do I not have headers? Headers exist. So I must have, so the error message, sorry, I kind of glossed over it. Basically, it said prop 0 is not found. Having been into the weeds of Data Factory, it wasn't able to map the columns. So what that means is I might have missed telling it that our source file actually has row headers in the first row. Yep, I missed that. So to correct that, right, that's at a data source level. And so my flat file connector, I forgot to tell it that first row is headers. So that's a really cool, it's a good error though. In this case, I'm going a slightly lazier approach. In many EDW patterns, they'll have an actual mapping file of column to column, but I'm letting ADF do it, and it'll only work if, obviously you have to have headers. It is case sensitive. So if you have mismatch, it won't match it. It'll error out. So yeah, that's, you know, a little annoying, but so now let's do trigger now.
What is the collection of the Azure?
Say again.
The collection of the
No, the source, the case sensitivity is at the ADF level. So it's not even touching the database yet, because what's happening is it's got an input data set, which happened to be a flat file. And let me, before. Well, one succeeded. What was the? Cannot be modified. I must have some more crazy stuff in some of these tables, but that's okay. At least one of them loaded, so we'll go into here. And the copy data activity, oh, it only had a whopping 2 rows, but it did its job. So to answer your question, Jesus, wait, that is your, yeah. You're normally online, so this is the first time I think I'm seeing you in person. So the ADF piece is reading the source and reading the metadata from the destination. And so it's ADF that is case sensitive. So regardless of what the collation on either of the side would be. So it is doing an exact match on the column name. So if you have the same, it's fine, it goes through. Cool. So that's the entire load pattern. One thing what typically would happen, so now the benefit of doing it this way, right? So we did actually have some errors. Triggered. Oh, so this is still running. This must be bigger. Yeah, so you can see it while it's executing. It's written 200,000 rows. But for the ones that errored out, right? And this is the advantage of doing it this way. Let's say one of the files that errored out, I went and fixed it. Let's say it was just some bad data in the flat file or something like that. So what I can do is I can just go straight to this pipeline, right? The actual piece that does the loading, and then choose to execute this pipeline. And then I would give it, all the values. So ADF, demo, raw, 220421, you know, sample.txt, something like that, right? Whichever the file is. So the modularity ends up being super helpful. And then because ADF is so dynamic, it allows you to pass in everything. Even that first row is header, I could parameterize all of that stuff, right? So I can have this one generic flat file to SQL pipeline set up, and have some of these generic pipelines set up or created. And then you can create, and then what you would do is, going back to here, then you'll create like this, the main orchestration level one for individual ones, right? So you might do a main one for finance data, and it's picking up from the finance container into whatever the pickup folder is, and then puts it into the finance cube staging database or something like that, right? And you're reusing these components over and over again. The one thing, because we ran out of time. So what I would, really the next step from here would be, I would then call the stored procedure to merge my data set, and I can just show you the code for it. Where's my SQL? So like invoices.txt. So that stored procedure would execute. So this stored procedure, so this is not an ADF thing, right? This is just typical database thing. So this one generates the merge script, and then I have a flag in there for debug mode. So this allows me to then see maybe not. Works for. So for example, it would then execute. Like a code like this, right? Or anything. And the benefit of this is to then doing all of this in parallel, so you're letting it load all sorts of stuff. Cool. That's pretty much it. Went a little over time, but we did see, at least we saw a couple of them finish. You guys have any questions?
Well, in the old SSIS, BPS, the success of error information, this kind of thing.
Yeah, there is a, so there are some things that I kind of miss. So there is a, so from this, like I can add more stuff, right? So on failure, let's just say on failure, have it run some stored procedure or something. So that's there. But you know, the one thing I used to typically do is I used to love being able to double click on this connector and then put some stuff in it too, right? Make it so usually I would do like if file exists, right? If the count is more than 0 or whatever, then execute this piece of the thing. That doesn't exist. It does have a set of if blocks or whatever. It had, yeah, so you can do a if condition or a switch thing, but it still has limitations because you can't go that many levels deep. So if you notice, if you look over here, I've got a for each loop, a if condition, a switch, and then now if I set this up and whatever my thing is, if I go into the true section, I can't go another layer deep. So then you can do other workarounds. So usually in this, I had whatever weird use case where I had to do stuff. So then instead that workload was just put in a different pipeline, and that pipeline had another set of if else kind of stuff, and you did it that way.
The other thing that we have on there is scripting, the C#.
Yeah. So for the online folks, the question is the scripting stuff. So the big difference here is if I, there we go. Because and this is a nature of the cloud, right? Everything is separated. So especially compute and storage are separated. And so in this case, your ADF is like this service that's running, and it's actually connecting a bunch of things together to make it work. So the big differences between this and SSIS is SSIS, everything's happening in that one box, in that one process. And it is super convenient to be able to do script tasks, and it will happen right there in that container. But in here, how you would approach that is using other services. So having it hooked up to like a function app to execute some piece of code through your pipeline. But unlike SSIS, like you don't have that actual real pipeline. Like I used to have a script task inside in the middle of a source and destination, right? And do that some transformation. That doesn't really exist because everything is a ELT pattern. So what you would do instead is have the data go to blob and then call a function app, which then reads it from that blob and does whatever it's going to do to it, or reads it from wherever, do the transformation, and then puts it, or whatever you're trying to do, right? It's a little disjointed that way. However, you still have a lot of flexibility. You could call a function app for a tiny little thing, or there's another thing called Azure Batch for some bigger, heavier processing where you truly need some beefiness, horsepower. Yeah, so it gives you some of that flexibility.
Can't do anything like data viewer because it sends it off as a batch.
Say again?
Like the data viewer.
Oh, yeah. So so the closest thing is like that debug stuff. You don't have that kind of debug mode, right? So you can't execute it and then like put a breakpoint or whatever. You can't do that. There are some breakpoints, but you're forced to essentially work off of stuff like this. So wherever it failed, kind of hover over it and see what it's complaining about.
Does it have better error messages than SSIS?
Yeah, what's your experience been?
Fixed.
Yeah. Error. I don't think there's any development tool that has still mastered that.
My favorite was I don't know what it was. It was like it was just something generic like unknown error. And it ended up being that I had a space in my data. I was using data flows, and my data flow had a space in the name. And while that's perfectly legal to do, when you execute the pipeline, if it's parameterized, it will fail with this unknown error. And that's all it will say is unknown error. It doesn't tell you, hey, there's a space in your data flow name, you gotta get rid of the space. It allows you to have the space in the data flow name. It took me like hours scouring the internet before I figured out what that
Yeah.
was.
Challenge thing with Azure. Times.
Yeah.
Different.
Yeah.
Is there any slowly changing dimension functionality built in?
So the one piece we didn't really go over, I mean, this was really more of like a ELT thing. But there's a thing in here called mapping data flows, or what do they call it now? Is it just called data flows now? And that's where you can do some more advanced.
Those the same data flows that's in Power BI?
No, that one's Power Query.
Well, yeah, it's still in the workspaces, right, not online.
Ye- Yeah, so that was using, so basically the thing is that one's using the Power Query engine, and it does essentially the kind of stuff that Power BI, Power Query that allows you to do. What this thing's actually doing is deep behind the scenes, it's generating data bricks in a Microsoft Azure managed thing. So you don't actually have to have a Databricks account or know how to use Databricks. It has this WYSIWYG editor. Where's my? Okay, there we go. It has this WYSIWYG editor where you can do some of the stuff that you typically could do inside an SSIS data flow task. But just know, so what it's actually doing deep behind the scenes is writing code to be executed in Databricks somewhere behind the scenes, right? And it has a bunch of stuff in here. Oh, I think it's in the actual transformations. You could override and tell it, use this big instance or a small instance, or let it just do it on its own, and it'll kind of manage it for you.
When you add it to the pipeline, you have options on that.
Yep. Yeah. And then it'll let you pick the integration runtimes to run it in, which is somewhat of some way of separating out the different compute resources. Like we had a person at our company that built just a giant elaborate pipeline, and he was starting to hit some of the limits on how many cores it could do. So it was so in this case, we created a handful of integration runtimes and would dedicate some parts of the data flow, mapping data flow to, let's say, integration runtime 1, 2, and 3, and then the next set of stuff into 4, 5, and 6. So it had more. Okay. All right.
You can produce files, right?
Like flat files? Yeah. And so, I mean, it is a cloud native thing, right? So it's obviously everything's easier to even output it to a blob storage. But using that in the self-hosted integration runtime, you could have it output to a network drive on-prem, just like you would in SSIS. Yeah.
Nice thing about data flows is do true TL as opposed to ELT. So you if I'm doing like data lake to data lake stuff, I can essentially transform the data in flight. I don't need to land it on a database and then run stored procedures to transform it. I can take the data from the data lake, transform it, and land it back into a data lake transform.
Yeah. The hardcore SQL people, though, will still want to put it in SQL, right? Because I mean, there are some things that yeah, that's probably still easier in SQL versus doing it in that, or even injecting some Python code. But yeah. Michael, do you have any questions before we log off for the day?
No, I'm just getting started with ADF. Tried to do a couple little pipelines, and they do. I went through documentation. They have a nice little pretty flow chart, like a hand scribbled one of how simple the process is. It's like a 39 step of process of everything where you have to go and kind of wraps around itself. It's kind of fun to show people, yeah, this would be a simple process. Just follow this flow. So I started working in on that, and yeah, okay, we're going to do pieces 8 through 12, and see if we can get a demo of just that part of it. So we tried a few proof of concepts that have, our main problems is hitting security issues and getting things provisioned for the right security accounts. That keeps slowing us down.
Security always slows things down. That's, yeah. Cool. Well, thanks everyone for coming. We'll be back on regular programming next month. So Evan, who already left, like I mentioned, he's got a cool presentation. So it's still more cloud stuff. Those ones are even cooler because it is using multiple tools to make stuff happen, right? So he's specifically going to focus on Fivetran and DBT to do the ELT workload. All right. Michael, thanks for joining us online.
Well, thank you for having it.
So you use